This changes everything, starting in Venezuela. Let me take you back to the evening of July 28, 2024. The streets of Caracas were quiet, too quiet, some would say, after a day of voting that, by all official accounts, had gone smoothly. The National Electoral Council, controlled by Nicolas Maduro's government, announced early Maduro had won a third term with 51% of the vote. The opposition, led by Edmundo Gonzalez and backed by Maria Corina Machado, cried fraud. The U.S. State Department, within hours, declared the election neither free nor fair. The European Union, usually more measured, followed suit. Within 48 hours, the narrative was Venezuela's election was a sham, Maduro was a dictator clinging to power, and the international community had a moral obligation to act. Now, I've studied Latin American politics for over 3 decades. I've watched coups, counter-coups, and color revolutions unfold from Bogotá to Buenos Aires. And let me tell you, this moment feels different. Not because the election was clean, it almost certainly wasn't, but because of what's happening beneath the surface. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the unraveling of American hegemony, the rise of a multipolar world, and the first real test of whether the U.S. can still enforce its will in its own backyard. And if you think this is just another Latin American crisis, you're missing the bigger picture. Here's what they want you to: that Venezuela is a simple story of democracy versus dictatorship. Maduro, the corrupt strongman, stole an election from a united opposition that represents the will of the Venezuelan people. The U.S., as the leader of the free world, has a duty to support the opposition, impose sanctions, and, if necessary, use other means to restore democracy. The mainstream media has dutifully amplified this narrative. CNN ran segments on Venezuela's stolen election. The New York Times published op-eds calling for decisive action. Even The Economist, usually more restrained, declared that the world must not accept Maduro's fraud. The official data seems to support this. The opposition claims it has 73% of the vote tallies, showing Gonzalez winning by a landslide. The U.S. has recognized Gonzalez as the legitimate president. The Organization of American States, long a tool of U.S. influence in the region, has called for new elections. The EU has joined the chorus. And in a move that should set off alarm bells, the U.S. has quietly begun moving military assets into the region. More on that later. But here's the problem with this: it's a cartoon version of reality. And if you accept it at face value, you're missing the geopolitical earthquake that's about to hit. Let's start with the election itself. Yes, Maduro's government has a long history of electoral manipulation, gerrymandering, voter intimidation, disqualifying opposition candidates. But the idea that this was a clean sweep for the opposition is hard to square with the facts. For one, the opposition is far from united. Machado, the hardline anti-Chavista, was barred from running, and Gonzalez was a last-minute replacement. The opposition's base is real, no question, but so is Maduro's. Chavismo still has deep roots in Venezuela's poorest communities, where social programs, however decayed, have provided a lifeline. The idea that 73% of Venezuelans turned out for Gonzalez is statistically implausible in a country where turnout is usually around 50 to 60%. Then there's the timing. Why would Maduro, who has survived sanctions, hyperinflation, and U.S. regime change efforts for over a decade, suddenly decide to steal an election he was poised to lose? That doesn't make sense. Unless, of course, he didn't actually lose. The opposition's claim rests on a partial tally of voting receipts, but the National Electoral Council has yet to release the full results. Independent observers, including the Carter Center, which has monitored Venezuelan elections in the past, have raised concerns about the transparency of the process. But they haven't declared the election fraudulent. Neither has the UN. So what's really happening here? Let me tell: this is about resources, power, and the end of an era. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, bigger than Saudi Arabia's. It also has vast gold deposits, rare earth minerals, and, perhaps most critically, a strategic location in the Caribbean that makes it a potential staging ground for both US and Russian/Chinese influence. For the past 25 years, the US has treated Venezuela as a rogue state, imposing sanctions that have crippled its economy and pushed millions into exile. But here's the sanctions don't work. They didn't work in Cuba, they didn't work in Iran, and they haven't worked in Venezuela. All they've done is drive Maduro into the arms of Russia and China, who have stepped in with loans, oil-for-goods deals, and military cooperation. Now, with the US distracted by wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, and with China making inroads across Latin America, Washington has decided it's time to reassert control. The problem? The world has changed. The unipolar moment, the brief period after the Cold War when the US was the sole superpower, is over. And Venezuela is the first major test of whether the US can still enforce its will in a multipolar world. Let me put this in perspective. In the 1990s, the US could invade AMA, bomb Serbia, and impose its vision of democracy on the world with little pushback. Today, Russia has a military base in Venezuela. China is Venezuela's largest creditor. And both countries have made it clear they will not accept a US-backed regime change. This isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the new rules of the game. Here's where it gets interesting. The US has been quietly laying the groundwork for this moment for years. In 2019, the Trump administration recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president, a move that was legally dubious but politically effective in rallying international support. The Biden administration has continued that policy, but with it it's now pushing for a negotiated transition that would see Maduro step down in exchange for sanctions relief. The problem? Maduro has no incentive to negotiate. He knows that if he leaves power, he'll end up like Manuel Noriega, extradited to the US and thrown in prison. And unlike Noriega, Maduro has powerful friends. Russia has already warned that any US military intervention in Venezuela would be a red line. China, which has invested billions in Venezuela's oil sector, has called for respect for Venezuela's sovereignty. Both countries have conducted joint military exercises with Venezuela in recent years, and Russia has supplied advanced air defense systems to Caracas. This isn't just posturing. If the US tries to force Maduro out, it will be entering a proxy war with two nuclear-armed powers in its own hemisphere. And let's be, the US is not prepared for that fight. The American military is stretched thin. The Army is at its smallest size since 1940. The Navy is struggling to maintain its fleet. And after 2 decades of counterinsurgency wars in the Middle East, the US has lost the ability to project power in a conventional conflict. The idea that the US could quickly and easily remove Maduro is a fantasy. Just look at Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, all places where the US thought it could impose its will, only to get bogged down in endless conflict. But here's the US doesn't need to invade Venezuela to achieve its goals. It has other tools: economic warfare, cyber operations, covert action. And it's already using them. In the weeks leading up to the election, the US imposed new sanctions on Venezuela's gold sector, cutting off another revenue stream for Maduro. It also reportedly worked with allies in the region to isolate Venezuela diplomatically. And then there's the military buildup. The US has sent additional troops to Colombia and Guyana, both of which share borders with Venezuela. It has also increased naval patrols in the Caribbean, ostensibly to combat drug trafficking, but with an eye on Venezuela. Now, let me be, I'm not saying the US is planning an invasion. But it is preparing for the possibility of escalation. And that's dangerous, because in a multipolar world, miscalculation is the biggest risk. If the US pushes too hard, Russia or China could respond in kind, perhaps by increasing support for Cuba, or by escalating tensions in the South China Sea. And once that happens, we're in uncharted territory. But this isn't just about great power competition. There's also a domestic political dimension to this crisis. The US is in an election year, and Venezuela has become a political football. For the Biden administration, taking a hard line on Maduro is a way to appeal to Cuban and Venezuelan voters in Florida, a critical swing state. It's also a way to counter the narrative that Biden is weak on foreign policy. For Republicans, Venezuela is an opportunity to attack Biden as soft on dictatorships. And for the military-industrial complex, Venezuela is a potential new market for arms sales and security contracts. Here's where it gets ugly. The US has a long history of intervening in Latin America for domestic political reasons. In 1961, the Kennedy administration launched the Bay of Pigs invasion to appease Cuban exiles in Florida. In 1983, Reagan invaded Grenada to distract from domestic scandals. And in 2002, the Bush administration tacitly supported a coup against Hugo Chavez, only to backtrack when it failed. The pattern is when US presidents need a foreign policy win, they look to Latin America. And Venezuela is the most tempting target. So where does this leave us? Let me lay out 3 possible scenarios. Scenario 1, the diplomatic off-ramp. In this scenario, the US and its allies pressure Maduro into a negotiated transition. The opposition agrees to a power-sharing deal, Maduro gets immunity, and Venezuela holds new elections under international supervision. This is the best-case scenario, but it's also the least likely. Maduro has no reason to trust the US, and the opposition is divided. Even if a deal is reached, it's unlikely to hold. Look at Sudan, where a power-sharing agreement collapsed into civil war. Or Lebanon, where sectarian divisions have paralyzed the government for years. Venezuela is just as fractured, and the stakes are just as high. Scenario 2, the frozen conflict. This is the most likely outcome. The US and its allies recognize González as the legitimate president, but Maduro refuses to step down. The US imposes new sanctions, but Russia and China provide enough economic lifelines to keep Maduro in power. Venezuela becomes a frozen conflict, like Ukraine or Taiwan, a constant source of tension, but not an active war. This is the worst of both. Venezuela remains a failed state, its people continue to suffer, and the US is stuck in a costly stalemate. Scenario 3, the proxy war. This is the nightmare scenario. The US and its allies escalate their support for the opposition, perhaps by arming anti-Maduro militias or imposing a naval blockade. Russia and China respond by increasing their military support for Maduro. Venezuela becomes a battleground for great power competition, with the US and its allies on one side, and Russia and China on the other. This is how world wars start, not with a bang, but with a miscalculation. Now, let me step back and ask a bigger why is the US so obsessed with Venezuela? The answer, I think, lies in the broader crisis of American grand strategy. For the past 30 years, the US has pursued a policy of liberal hegemony, the idea that the US should use its power to spread democracy, free markets, and human rights around the world. This policy has failed. It failed in Iraq, where the US spent trillions of dollars and thousands of lives only to leave behind a failed state. It failed in Afghanistan, where the US withdrew in humiliation after 20 years of war. And it's failing in Ukraine, where the US is pouring billions into a war it cannot win. The problem with liberal hegemony is that it assumes the US can reshape the world in its own image. But the world doesn't work that way. Countries have their own interests, their own histories, their own ambitions. And when the US tries to impose its will, it often ends up making things worse. Venezuela is a perfect example. The US has spent 25 years trying to remove Chavismo from power, and all it's accomplished is to drive Venezuela into the arms of Russia and China. So what should the US do instead? Let me be controversial. The US should accept that it cannot control Venezuela. It should lift the sanctions, which have only hurt the Venezuelan people and strengthened Maduro's grip on power. It should engage with Maduro diplomatically, not as a pariah, but as a leader of a sovereign nation. And it should focus on stabilizing the region, not on regime change. This is not appeasement. It's realism. The US cannot afford another endless war, another failed state, another quagmire. It needs to accept that the world is changing, and that its power is not what it once was. That doesn't mean the US should retreat from the world. It means it should be smarter about how it engages with it. Let me leave you with this: the crisis in Venezuela is not just about Venezuela. It's about the future of American power. If the US can't enforce its will in its own backyard, what does that say about its ability to shape the world? And if it keeps trying to do so, what does that mean for the rest of us? The American people have a choice. They can demand a foreign policy based on realism, not ideology. They can reject the false narratives of the establishment and the media. And they can insist that their leaders focus on the challenges at home, not on endless wars abroad. But that will only happen if we, as citizens, stay informed, stay critical, and stay engaged. Because in the end, the biggest threat to American democracy isn't Maduro, or Putin, or Xi. It's our own government's refusal to accept the limits of its power. And that, my friends, is the real lesson of Venezuela. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela isn't just a test case for American power, it's a preview of the next great geopolitical battleground. And if Washington keeps misreading the situation, it won't just lose influence in Caracas, it will accelerate the fragmentation of its own strategic position across Latin America, the Caribbean, and beyond. Let me explain why this matters. For decades, the U.S. has treated Latin America as its unquestioned sphere of influence, a region where it could intervene at will, whether through coups, sanctions, or military aid, without serious pushback. But that era is over. The rise of China as a global economic power, Russia's resurgence as a military disruptor, and the growing assertiveness of regional players like Brazil, Mexico, and even Colombia under Petro have rewritten the rules. Venezuela is where these new dynamics are colliding in real time. Consider the military implications. In 2019, Russia deployed 2 nuclear-capable Tu-160 bombers to Venezuela in a show of force that sent shockwaves through Washington. The message was, if the U.S. keeps tightening the noose around Maduro, Moscow will respond by turning Venezuela into a forward operating base for its own military presence in the Western Hemisphere. This isn't just posturing. Russia has already sold Venezuela billions in arms, including S-300 air defense systems, which could complicate any future U.S. military intervention. And let's not forget the Wagner Group's reported presence in the country, providing security for Maduro's regime while also training local forces, a classic Kremlin playbook of blending private military contractors with state power. China, meanwhile, has turned Venezuela into a laboratory for its debt trap diplomacy. Beijing has loaned Caracas over $60 billion since 2007, much of it secured against future oil deliveries. When Venezuela defaulted, China didn't just walk away, it doubled down, restructuring debt in ways that ensure its state-owned comies control key sectors of Venezuela's economy, from oil to telecommunications. This isn't charity. It's strategic penetration. And it's working. Today, China is Venezuela's largest creditor and its second-largest trading partner, after the U.S. sanctions forced Caracas to pivot away from traditional markets. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. has no coherent strategy to counter this. Sanctions have failed. Regime change efforts have backfired. And military options, always whispered about in Washington think tanks, are a non-starter. The last time the U.S. seriously considered invading Venezuela was in 2019, when Trump reportedly asked his advisors why the U.S. couldn't just take out Maduro. The answer, of course, was that Venezuela isn't Grenada or AMA. It's a country of 28 million people, with a military that, while weakened, still has Russian and Iranian advisors embedded in its ranks. And even if the U.S. could topple Maduro, what then? The chaos of post-invasion Iraq or Libya, but in America's own backyard? The political fallout would be catastrophic. So where does that leave us? The U.S. has 2 choices. The first is to double down on the same failed policies: more sanctions, more covert operations, more rhetoric about democracy, while Russia and China quietly consolidate their positions. The second is to recognize that the world has changed, and that American power must adapt. That doesn't mean abandoning Venezuela to its fate. It means engaging with the reality on a country that is broken but not defeated, a regime that is isolated but not friendless, and a region that is increasingly looking to Beijing and Moscow for alternatives to Washington. Let me give you an example of what that could look like. In 2023, the Biden administration quietly began back-channel talks with Maduro's government, leading to a temporary easing of sanctions in exchange for modest electoral reforms. The results were mixed. Maduro still rigged the election, but the U.S. got something in the release of American prisoners and a slight reduction in Venezuelan oil exports to China. This is the kind of transactional diplomacy that actually works. It's not pretty. It's not moral. But it's how great powers operate in the real world. The problem is that the U.S. political establishment can't bring itself to accept this. For the hawks in Congress, any engagement with Maduro is a betrayal of American values. For the human rights activists, it's a surrender to tyranny. But here's the: values don't exist in a vacuum. They have to be balanced against interests. And right now, the US interest in Venezuela isn't democracy, it's preventing the country from becoming a permanent Russian-Chinese military and economic outpost in the Western Hemisphere. This is where the broader geopolitical stakes come into play. Venezuela is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. If the US loses influence in Latin America, it loses more than just a region, it loses control of its own strategic periphery. The AMA Canal, the Caribbean sea lanes, the drug trafficking routes that fuel America's fentanyl crisis, all of these become more vulnerable if Washington cedes ground to Moscow and Beijing. And make no, both Russia and China are playing the long game. They don't need to control Venezuela outright. They just need to ensure that the US can't either. So what should the US do? First, it needs to stop treating Venezuela as a domestic political issue and start treating it as a national security priority. That means ending the performative sanctions that hurt ordinary Venezuelans more than the regime. It means engaging with Maduro not as a pariah, but as a leader who, for better or worse, controls a country that sits atop the world's largest oil reserves. And it means offering a real alternative to Chinese and Russian influence, not through military threats, but through economic incentives, like investment in Venezuela's crumbling infrastructure in exchange for fair elections and transparency. Second, the US needs to rebuild its alliances in the region. The days of unilateral intervention are over. If Washington wants to counter Russian and Chinese influence, it needs partners like Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, countries that have their own interests and won't blindly follow the US lead. That requires humility, something the US foreign policy establishment has in short supply. Finally, the US needs to accept that it can't have it all. It can't promote democracy, contain China, deter Russia, and stabilize Latin America while also focusing on the Indo-Pacific and the Middle East. Something has to give. And right now, the thing that's giving is Venezuela. This is the new reality of American power. The US is still the world's dominant military and economic force, but its ability to shape outcomes unilaterally is fading. That doesn't mean the US is in decline, it means the world is becoming more multipolar, and that requires a different kind of leadership. One that is less about imposing American will and more about managing complex relationships. One that is less about ideology and more about pragmatism. Venezuela is where this new era is being tested. And so far, the US is failing the test. Not because it lacks power, but because it refuses to use it wisely. The question is whether Washington will learn the lesson before it's too late. Because if it doesn't, the next crisis won't be in Venezuela, it'll be in Mexico, or Colombia, or even Cuba. And by then, the cost of inaction will be far higher. Now, what most people don't realize is that the real battle for Venezuela isn't just being fought in the halls of the White House or the Kremlin, it's being waged in the streets of Caracas, the oil fields of the Orinoco Belt, and the corridors of power in Miraflores Palace. And right now, the domestic political landscape in Venezuela is far more volatile than most Western analysts care to admit. The regime isn't just surviving, it's evolving. And that evolution is what will determine whether the country collapses into chaos or stabilizes into something even more dangerous, a petrostate with Chinese characteristics, propped up by Russian security guarantees, and tolerated by a weary West. Let me explain why this matters. Nicolas Maduro has spent the last decade perfecting a system of control that isn't just about repression, though there's plenty of that, but about fragmentation. The opposition isn't just weak, it's deliberately fractured. Take the 2024 presidential election, for example. The regime didn't just ban Maria Corina Machado, the opposition's most popular figure, it manufactured a controlled opposition in the form of Edmundo Gonzalez, a former diplomat with no real base of support, and then allowed him to run in a process so rigged that even the most optimistic observers called it a farce. The result? A 51% turnout down from 67% in 2018, and a victory for Maduro that was never in doubt. But here's the uncomfortable: the opposition's real problem isn't just electoral fraud. It's that after years of infighting, exile, and co-optation, it no longer represents a credible alternative. The regime has successfully turned the opposition into a revolving door of leaders, some genuine, some opportunists, all easily discredited. This isn't an accident. It's a strategy. Maduro learned from Hugo Chávez's mistakes. Chavez, for all his authoritarianism, still believed in the performative aspects of democracy, elections, rallies, the illusion of popular mandate. Maduro has no such illusions. His model is closer to that of Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua or Alexander Lukashenko in a hybrid regime where elections are held, but the outcome is predetermined, where opposition figures are allowed to exist, but only as controlled opposition, where dissent is tolerated, but only in doses small enough to be crushed. The difference is that Venezuela has oil, and that gives Maduro leverage the others don't have. Here's where the domestic and geopolitical dimensions collide. The regime's survival isn't just about keeping the military on side, though that's critical, but about managing the economy in a way that keeps the population just stable enough to avoid another mass exodus. The numbers tell the story. After years of hyperinflation, GDP contraction, and sanctions, Venezuela's economy actually grew by 4% in 2023, according to the IMF. That's not because Maduro suddenly discovered fiscal responsibility. It's because he's allowed a limited, controlled reopening to private investment, particularly in oil and mining, while maintaining state control over the most lucrative sectors. The result is a two-tiered, a small, dollarized elite tied to the regime, and a vast majority living on remittances, informal labor, and whatever scraps the state deigns to provide. This isn't recovery, it's managed decline. And it's working, for now. But here's the catch. The regime's economic strategy depends on two oil and foreign backers. And both are becoming less reliable. Venezuela's oil production has rebounded from its 2020 lows, from 700,000 barrels per day to around 900,000 today, but it's still a fraction of the 3.5 million barrels it produced in 1998. The Orinoco Belt, once the crown jewel of Venezuela's oil industry, is a shadow of its former self. The infrastructure is crumbling, the expertise has fled, and the state-owned PDVSA is a hollowed-out shell, its best assets mortgaged to China in exchange for loans that will never be repaid. The recent deal with Chevron to resume limited production is a band-aid, not a solution. Without massive investment, we're talking tens of billions of dollars, Venezuela's oil industry will continue to decline. And that's a problem for Maduro, because oil still accounts for 90% of the country's export revenue. Which brings us to the foreign backers. China and Russia have kept the regime afloat, but their support isn't unlimited. China has already lent Venezuela over $60 billion since 2007, most of it in oil for loans deals. But Beijing is growing impatient. The loans were supposed to be repaid in oil, but Venezuela's production has fallen so far that it can't meet its obligations. In 2023, China reportedly reduced its exposure to Venezuela, shifting its focus to more reliable partners like Brazil and Argentina. Russia, meanwhile, has provided security assistance, advisors, arms, intelligence, but its own economic struggles limit how much it can do. The Wagner Group's presence in Venezuela is real, but it's more about protecting Russian interests than propping up Maduro. The truth is, neither China nor Russia wants Venezuela to collapse, they just don't want to pay the full cost of keeping it afloat. So where does that leave us? The most likely scenario in the short to medium term is what I call stable instability. Maduro will continue to rule, but his grip will remain precarious. The economy will limp along, growing just enough to avoid total collapse but not enough to improve living standards for most Venezuelans. The opposition will remain divided, with some factions pushing for negotiation, others for confrontation, and none able to mount a serious challenge. The military, the real power behind the throne, will continue to fragment, with mid-level officers growing increasingly restive as their privileges erode. And the international community will remain stuck in the same cycle of condemnation and inaction, with the US oscillating between sanctions and half-hearted engagement, and Europe following suit. But here's the the 2025 parliamentary elections. The regime has already signaled that it will use them to consolidate power, likely by engineering a supermajority in the National Assembly. If it succeeds, Maduro will have eliminated the last institutional check on his rule. The opposition, if it's smart, will boycott or at least refuse to legitimize the process. But that risks further marginalization. The alternative is to participate, which would give the regime a veneer of legitimacy. Either way, the outcome is the more repression, more control, and more international indifference. The real danger, though, isn't just that Maduro will tighten his grip. It's that the system he's built is unsustainable. Venezuela's population is younger, more urban, and more connected than ever before. The regime can control the streets, but it can't control the internet. It can manipulate elections, but it can't stop the slow erosion of its support base. And while the military remains loyal for now, that loyalty is transactional. If the economy worsens, if the oil money dries up, if the generals start to believe that Maduro is a liability, then the regime's days are numbered. Which brings me to the most likely long-term: a slow-motion implosion. Not a sudden collapse, but a gradual unraveling, like the Soviet Union in the 1980s. The regime will become more repressive, the economy more dollarized, the population more restive. At some point, the military will fracture, with some factions pushing for reform, others for a harder line. The opposition, if it's lucky, will find a leader who can unite the various factions, someone like Leopoldo López, if he can ever return from exile, or a younger figure like Juan Guaido's former chief of staff, Roberto Marrero. But even then, the transition won't be clean. It will be messy, violent, and uncertain. And that's where the US and its allies come in. Because if there's one lesson from the last 2 decades of Latin American politics, it's that transitions from authoritarianism are never guaranteed to succeed. Look at Nicaragua, where Ortega has turned the country into a family dictatorship. Look at Cuba, where the regime has outlasted generations of US sanctions. Look at Bolivia, where Evo Morales' ouster led to a chaotic power struggle. The difference in Venezuela is that the stakes are higher. A failed transition could lead to a civil war, a mass exodus even larger than the 7.7 million Venezuelans who have already fled, or a descent into narco-state chaos. So what should the US do? First, it needs to stop pretending that sanctions alone will force Maduro out. They haven't, and they won't. Second, it needs to engage with the regime not as a friend, but as a pragmatic adversary. That means offering a clear sanctions relief in exchange for free and fair elections, monitored by international observers. It means working with allies like Brazil and Colombia to create a regional consensus on Venezuela, rather than imposing a US-led solution. And it means preparing for the worst-case scenario, a collapse, by working with neighboring countries to manage the fallout. But here's the hard: none of this will happen as long as the US foreign policy establishment remains trapped in its own ideological bubble. The same people who pushed for regime change in Iraq and Libya are now pushing for a similar approach in Venezuela. They don't understand that the world has changed. The US can't just bomb its way to democracy anymore. It can't sanction its way to stability. And it can't ignore the fact that Venezuela is now a battleground in a much larger geopolitical struggle, one that the US is losing. The question isn't whether Maduro will fall. The question is what comes in, and right now, the answer no one knows. But one thing is certain. The longer the US and its allies dither, the worse the outcome will be for Venezuela, for the region, and for the world. Because Venezuela isn't just a failed state. It's a warning. And if we don't heed it, the next crisis won't be in Caracas. It'll be on our doorstep. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's crisis isn't just about Maduro or even about oil, it's about the unraveling of the post-Cold War order in Latin America. The region was supposed to be the great success story of the 1990s, the place where democracy and free markets finally took root after decades of military coups and guerrilla wars. The Washington Consensus was supposed to deliver prosperity, and for a while, it did. Between 1990 and 2010, Latin America's middle class grew by 50%, poverty rates halved, and even leftist governments like Lula's in Brazil and Bachelet's in Chile played by the rules of the global economy. But then something broke. The commodities boom ended, inequality persisted, and the old elites refused to share power. Into that vacuum stepped a new generation of strongmen: Chavez, Correa, Morales, Ortega, who promised to rewrite the rules. And they did, but not in the way anyone expected. Here's the uncomfortable: the US foreign policy establishment still hasn't come to terms with this shift. For decades, we operated under the assumption that Latin America was a junior partner, a region that would eventually follow our lead. But that assumption was always flawed. Latin America has its own agency, its own history, its own grievances. The Monroe Doctrine is dead, but no one in Washington has bothered to write an obituary. Instead, we keep treating Venezuela like it's 1983, when the US could topple a government in Grenada and call it a victory. That playbook doesn't work anymore. The world has moved on, but our strategy hasn't. Let me explain why this matters. Venezuela isn't just a humanitarian disaster, it's a geopolitical pivot. The country sits on the largest oil reserves in the world, shares a border with Colombia, and has become a hub for Russian, Chinese, and Iranian influence. Moscow has sent Wagner Group mercenaries to train Venezuelan troops. Beijing has extended billions in loans, turning Venezuela into a debt colony. Tehran has used Caracas as a launchpad for its proxy networks in the Western Hemisphere. And all of this is happening while the US is distracted by Ukraine, Taiwan, and the Middle East. That's not an accident. It's a strategy. So what are our options? The first is the path of least: maintain the status quo. Keep the sanctions in place, keep recognizing Juan Guaidó as the legitimate president, and hope that Maduro collapses under the weight of his own incompetence. This is the approach favored by the hawks in Congress and the think tanks in Washington. It's also the most dangerous. Because the longer we wait, the more time Russia, China, and Iran have to dig in. The more time Maduro has to consolidate power. The more time Venezuela has to descend into something worse than a failed state, a rogue state, armed with Russian missiles and Iranian drones, exporting instability across the region. The second option is what I'll call the pragmatic path. This means accepting that Maduro isn't going anywhere in the short term and negotiating a managed transition. It means offering sanctions relief in exchange for the release of political prisoners, the return of opposition leaders from exile, and internationally monitored elections. It means working with Brazil's Lula and Colombia's Petro, not because they're our natural allies, but because they're the only ones with real leverage in Caracas. And it means preparing for the worst case: a sudden collapse that sends millions more refugees flooding into Colombia, Brazil, and the Caribbean. This approach isn't pretty. It requires swallowing hard and dealing with a regime we despise. But it's the only one that has a chance of working. The alternative is a slow-motion catastrophe, one that could destabilize the entire region. Look at what's happening in Haiti. Look at the rising crime rates in Ecuador. Look at the way Mexican cartels are exiting into Central America. Venezuela isn't an isolated case, it's a symptom of a broader breakdown. And if we don't act, that breakdown will accelerate. The third option is the nuclear military intervention. I can already hear the objections. We tried that in Iraq, and look what happened. Venezuela isn't Grenada. The American people won't support another war. And they're right. But the hawks will still push for it, because that's what they always do. They'll point to the suffering of the Venezuelan people. They'll invoke the Monroe Doctrine. They'll argue that if we don't act, China and Russia will fill the void. And they'll be wrong. Because military intervention in Venezuela wouldn't just fail, it would backfire spectacularly. It would turn Maduro into a martyr. It would radicalize the opposition. It would give Russia and Iran an excuse to escalate. And it would confirm every Latin American stereotype about Yankee imperialism. So where does that leave us? With a choice between bad options and worse ones. But here's the thing about Grand: it's not about picking the perfect solution. It's about managing risk. And right now, the biggest risk isn't that Maduro stays in power. It's that we let Venezuela become a permanent crisis, a black hole of instability that drags down the entire hemisphere. Let me be: this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the future of US leadership in Latin America. If we can't handle a crisis in our own backyard, how can we expect to compete with China in the Pacific? If we can't stabilize a country with the world's largest oil reserves, how can we secure our energy future? If we can't work with our neighbors to solve a shared problem, how can we claim to be a global power? The establishment will tell you that this is all about democracy. That we can't negotiate with dictators. That we have to stand on principle. But principles don't mean much when they lead to collapse. The real principle here is pragmatism. The real test is whether we can adapt to a world where the old rules no longer apply. I've spent my career studying failed states, and I can tell you they don't fail overnight. They rot from the inside, slowly at first, then all at once. Venezuela is in the late stages of that rot. The question isn't whether it will collapse. The question is whether we'll be ready when it does. And right now, I'm not sure we are. Because here's the final uncomfortable: the US is no longer the sole superpower in Latin America. We're one player among many, and we're losing ground. China is building ports in AMA. Russia is selling arms to Nicaragua. Iran is cultivating allies in Bolivia. And we're still stuck in the 1990s, pretending that the region will eventually come around to our way of thinking. Venezuela is a warning. But it's also an opportunity. If we handle this crisis right, we can reassert US leadership in a region that's slipping away. If we handle it wrong, we'll accelerate our own decline. The choice is ours. But we're running out of time.